we are ready for chapter 11, which is sculpture and installation. So this is there will be one more chapter after this one in this branch of art that we're talking about, which is all the different mediums that you can use. And so this one, they've clumped together sculpture and installation, which is definitely in the same family. We'll look at several examples of each of those and modern examples as well as historic ones. The basic ways of sculpture, the methods that you can use to create sculpture are modeling, which is additive, assembling, which is additive, carving is subtractive, and casting involves a mold. So we will go through each of those methods for sculpture, showing examples of them and describing the process a little bit. Sculpture involves works of art dealing with three-dimensional space. Everything we've talked about so far has primarily been two-dimensional space: painting, drawing, printmaking. Camera and computer arts is primarily two-dimensional as well, although it starts to deal with the last artwork we looked at, or the artist we looked at, things that appear to be three-dimensional, like video images, but they are still technically two-dimensional. With sculpture, we do have the three dimensions. We have a height, a width, and a depth. Sculpture in the round is a terminology which means freestanding artwork that can be viewed from any angle, completed on all sides. So when you see a work of art where you can actually walk around it and look at the statue, look at the sculpture from all sides, then you know you're looking at a sculpture in the round. So a couple of examples of those we will look at. We'll just take a second to get those notes copied down. This is called The Burghers of Calais by Auguste Rodin, 1884, and this is a really famous work of art. You can see these figures if you were to walk around them from all directions. You would be able to see a different view of the figures. In fact, the way he sculpted this and arranged the figures, they are all looking a different direction, and so if you can picture yourself standing next to this bronze statue, you're kind of like pulled around the sculpture trying to see each person. So we're looking at it from this view. We can see three of the men pretty well. We can't see the other three very well. So then you want to like walk around the side to see the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. So it's kind of like gives you that feeling of you want to circle around it to be able to see all the figures, see what they're doing, look at their faces. And it's intentional that the artist did that to create that effect of the six men really taking up this space and almost like branching out from it, like they're looking in different directions, and so it causes us to go in different directions as we look at it. This would definitely be a great example of sculpture in the round. Looking at it in a photograph like this doesn't do it justice. You can see you're just looking straight on at one view of it. You're not getting the full effect of how the artist intends you to look at it, which is walking around. This sculpture is outside of an art museum, and you can see, I don't know if you can tell what that is, but you probably can. It's a 30-foot tall bronze sculpture, and it's actually at the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. It's got a strange presence, and if you walk up to it, try to picture yourself in that space with a 30-foot tall sculpture. You can see the little fence right here to kind of give you a reference for how big it is. The name of this one is Maman, which is actually French for mom. the artist Louise Bourgeois created this as a metaphor for her own mother. And so she kind of sees her mother this way, but not as a scary thing necessarily, just as awesomely tall, protective, patient, skilled. And also, her mother was a person who did like weaving and things like that, did fiber arts. And so she perhaps associated the weaving of a web with a spider with her mother, and like the delicate, intricate work that she had to do in weaving things. So anyway, that's a little background on this one. But this too, as you can tell, is a sculpture in the round. Think about walking around this thing. In this case, you're looking up at it as you walk around it. But you can walk between the legs, you can walk around the legs, experience that whole space around the sculpture. Definitely not meant to be just seen from one point of view, though, is it? It's meant to be seen from all directions. So those are two examples of the many, many examples I know you can think of just going in a city or a place, an establishment that has some sort of statue outside of a famous person, or like the Cardinal Stadium in St. Louis has sculptures all the way around it that were done by an artist of famous baseball players, and you can look. Those are all sculptures in the round. Like you walk all the way around them and look at them three-dimensionally. So a lot of sculptures we're familiar with. When we think of sculpture, we oftentimes do think of sculpture in the round. However, there's another type, which is called relief sculpture. In relief sculpture, forms project from but remain attached to a background surface. So they are only meant to be seen from the frontal view or slightly to the side. So we have two types of that. We have low relief, which is also called bas relief, and that's where the figures only slightly project from the background. We'll look at some examples of that. And then we have high relief, where the forms dramatically project from the background by generally at least half their depth, and sometimes more. Sometimes things will stick out entirely three-dimensionally from their background. They're attached to it still, but like a hand or something will come completely out of the background. So that's high relief. Kind of makes sense. Low relief is low to the ground. High relief, or low to the surface. High relief is sticking out much more. And so we'll look at this example, and then we're going to kind of compare the two. This is low relief or bas relief, and you can see it's part of architecture most likely. A lot of times you'll see bas relief as part of architecture. This particular one, I believe, is embellishing the top edges of a building, or sort of more of a decorative motif along the top of a building or room. And it's just carved out of the stone or material that this is made out of, and it doesn't entirely project out. You can see, like, yes, you could feel that texture. Texture is one of our elements of art we've talked about. So this would be actual texture. You can actually feel how this is sticking out from the surface. You could actually feel the texture of this necklace if you were to feel it. So it's real texture, it's real three-dimensional, but it's not sticking out very much. Overall, it doesn't have an extreme amount of depth to it. And really, every portion of this is attached pretty securely, like nothing is sticking out too far from the flat surface. So, like down here, this kind of gives you an idea. Look at this ledge that it appears everybody's standing on. So that probably was like the original thickness of this stone, and then it's carved into it so it sets back. So as the artist is working, they're thinking, okay, what are the parts that are going to go back the furthest? And they carve those parts out the most. And then things that they want to stick out, like to show the roundness of this arm, they make sure they leave that sticking out more, but then it kind of curves back in a rounded way. So You're not dealing with that much depth, but enough to create that three-dimensional effect. Bas relief, low relief. And then here's an example of high relief, and you can just see it's got a lot more depth to it, right? And again, look at the stone that it's carved out of. This is a much deeper inset to create more depth, and that the figures are sticking out further from the surface. This guy's arm right here, if you'll look at it, the carving probably doesn't fully make this arm free of the background. It probably is still connected back there a little bit, but nearly free of it. So the things that stick out the most are almost carved entirely free of the background, but of course they have to stay attached to it in some way or they just fall off. But you can see it has a lot more depth than the low relief does. So this is an example of high relief. And there are high relief sculptures that are even more dramatic than this one, that have even a deeper depth to them. Height, width, and depth. Where 2D only has height and width, doesn't have a depth to it. So what are the different types of, well, first before I do that, I want to just click back on this one real fast. Think of this one, which does have a lot of shadows and highlights, a lot of texture, a lot of three-dimensional quality to it, but compare it back to this one by Rodin. How do they feel different, or do they have less of an impact when they're not freestanding, such as this one is? What can an artist do and portray differently when they are creating a sculpture in the round versus a relief sculpture? And do you think it matters? Do you think that it is better to do one way or the other? It's just something to think about, like, what's the difference? How would this be different if it were like, say, a giant relief sculpture on the side of this building versus just a freestanding sculpture out here by itself as a sculpture in the round? So just thinking about that, of course the purposes are different. Like, this building doesn't need decoration on the side. It's already a sculpture in itself, really. However, the purpose of this relief sculpture was probably to decorate or create artwork within a space of a building or a room or the outside of a building. And so, or to tell a story, since this is Durga fighting the buffalo demon in India, it's probably telling one of the stories of their ancestry and heritage of their culture and religion. So maybe it had its purpose for that, but it's just kind of interesting to think about the difference between relief and sculpture in the round. Okay, so moving on to the different types of sculpture that we have. The first one we'll talk about is modeling. Modeling is not a fashion model. It is taking a substance and using manipulation to form it into what you want, and it is usually where you add pieces of something else to it. So we call it an additive process. You want to make sure you get that in your notes, that modeling is an additive process. The sculptor begins with a framework or nothing at all and adds material until the sculpture is finished. It's a very direct method of working, meaning when we use this terminology of direct or indirect, it means what you are making at the moment is what the finished piece will be. Indirect, you'll see, goes through a process. So the thing that you actually make with your hands in the beginning goes through multiple steps and becomes, it will be the same thing that you've made, but it goes through a process to get to that point. So clay, also known as terracotta, I should clarify, there are many types of clay. Terracotta is just one of the most common types. And terracotta is a very organic, highly organic in content. So it's clay that you can dig up from the ground. Really, any clay can be dug up from the ground, but terracotta has a little bit more organic matter in it, and it is more porous as a material when you use it, and it has a lot of roughness to it, a lot of what we call grout in the clay world. It's like it's got a lot of almost like gravelly. It's a rougher clay. It's not a super smooth clay like porcelain would be. But it is the most common material, modeling material, and it's been used for thousands of years because it is something that's just common to like dig up out of the ground and then to create work out of it. So clay in general is really the most common modeling material, and then this terracotta is historically what you'll see oftentimes, and especially like ancient sculptures, things that have been excavated from old cultures, ancient cultures around the world. And Africa, Asia, South America, North America, really all the major ancient cultures we can find works of art from are oftentimes made out of terracotta. And then sometimes they have been fired in high fire kilns, but oftentimes sun baking has created made it more of a more durable fired material, just using the sun and the heat from the sun. But anyway, it is the most common. Clay is the most common, and many sculptors use clay to make what we would think of as three-dimensional sketches before using another material. So with drawing, we've looked at that as we've gone through the previous chapters. A lot of artists will make preliminary drawings or sketches, planning their painting, planning their finished drawing, working it out. Even in camera and computer arts, they might take practice images or play around with different images that they draw, sketch, take on camera, take videos, and those are the preliminary things that become something else eventually. Same thing with sculpting. A lot of times clay is used as the preliminary material. And even in design, like car design, I don't know if they still do it today with technology as it is, but there was always made a clay mock-up of a car design, even made out of clay. So it's a common material. And have you ever used clay before? What's your experience with clay? Have you found it in the ground? It's very difficult if you're trying to plant a garden that's full of clay, or even grass for that matter. Or have you used clay in school and have the idea of what clay does? It's a very moldable material. It's a very biblical material, used a lot in Scripture to reference, like the potter and the clay, God being in control of our lives and forming us. And even in Genesis, when man was created, God created Adam out of the dust of the ground, and it said he was formed. I think I alluded to that in our very first chapter, that he formed him. Same word, formed, is the same word that is used later in the Bible to describe a potter making a piece of ceramic on the pottery wheel. So it is very connected closely with who we are as humans in relation to God as well. So our first example of modeling, and these were both done with clay, is first one is a stirrup spout portrait vessel from the Moqui in Central Andes. This is like Peru, and this stirrup spout vessel is a very common form for South America and also North America, some of the more ancient cultures that inhabited those areas. In this particular picture, you can't see how it is, but that thing that's coming off the top of the face is actually like a spout. And if you were to see it from the side, it makes like a U shape. So it's attached to the head in the front, And then this part actually curves around and is attached back here. So there's a stirrup right here that you can't totally see. And then you have this spout that comes off the top of it. And that's a really common form from these ancient South American cultures. And no one knows exactly why. They think perhaps it was utilitarian purpose. You could actually carry these vessels using the stirrup, and they're called stirrups because it's shaped like a stirrup, like a saddle stirrup. And you could carry them that way, so it's functional. You can pour out of the vessel, obviously, through the top. But they think that there's probably more meaning in that loop shape handle than just carrying it. They're not totally sure. It could have to do with two parts of life coming together. Could be like man and woman coming together through marriage. It could be man to earth. There's all kinds of speculation as to what those stirrups actually mean. And then the way these were made, they're just very common in this region of the world to find these. Sometimes they were buried in graves with people. Sometimes they just found them within the ruins of civilizations that were like obviously an everyday thing. But strangely, a lot of them had these faces. That was a common design for these. They found many with faces like in the later time periods of these cultures. Some regions had the faces, and other places would have just like plain pots with lots of designs on them. So it's kind of interesting how within that same region of the world, now it's hundreds of years time span, but you just see a lot of these stirrup vessels. They were sculpted by hand, so they would have been made out of clay, sculpted by hand, or modeled, as we call it, to make that face. And then they would make a mold of these a lot of times so that they could cast, and we'll talk about what that means later, they could cast multiples so that this would be a repeated stirrup spout vessel. And then the spout on top was added by hand. They would form that out of clay. It's like a tube, and they would attach it and then smooth it down and make it look like that. The other example on this page is just to show another terracotta sculpture. Don't have a lot of information on this one, but it just shows the delicate modeling. So remember when we said modeling, it's like you start with nothing or maybe a framework. So maybe they just started with a big lump of clay, and then they just kept adding more to it. Like, oh, the head needs to stick out here, so you add some more clay there and shape it a little bit. Oh, the nose needs to stick out. So you kind of form a lump of clay, stick it on, and smooth it and blend it and shape it into the shape of the nose. The hat, or the crown, you form it generally, stick it on the head, and then sculpt the detail to look like you want it to look. So that's additive, where you're starting with either nothing and just adding to it, or maybe just starting with a basic lump of clay and then continuing to add pieces until you get that shape and form that you want it to be. And then artists that do modeling like this, especially of details like these faces and the folds in the fabric and the complexity of that crown thing she's wearing, the hair, they use tools a lot of times. Little wooden tools or different types of sculptural tools that will help them to sculpt and form all those details that your fingers can't quite get into. But it's very three-dimensional, right? This is a photograph of a three-dimensional sculpture. So if you were to see this thing in person, this is an example of sculpture in the round. You could walk all the way around it. You can see the texture and that it's actually sticking up from the surface. And then clearly clay is one color. And these were terracotta, both of these. So when they make them out of clay, they're just like brown or reddish brown. And then after they are fired, the clay is heated to a high temperature, either through the sun or in kilns. They're fired so that it's more durable. The clay becomes harder and either goes through a chemical process or starts to go through a chemical process to be ceramic. And then after that is when they would paint them colors. And you can see this one's old and the paint's being worn off, but you get the idea. In fact, this skin color is wearing off here, and that probably shows the real orangey terracotta underneath. of what that original clay was like. Okay, so those are two examples of modeling. You add on, you keep building up the surface, shaping it how you want it. The next one we'll show is called casting, which is very indirect, where modeling is direct and additive, casting is indirect. You start with something that you make, and then it involves a mold, and then the mold is used, the original artwork goes away, the mold of that artwork is kept, and then some other sort of liquid or metal is poured into the mold to create a new cast of your original artwork. So what I've said is pretty much what this definition says. Casting is a very indirect method of working. It involves a mold of some kind into which liquid or semi-liquid is poured and allowed to harden. And bronze is a common casting material. So here would be an example. I'll let you copy that down. Of a Bodhisattva from India, which is a god, a Buddhist god. So when you look at this, you might think, oh, well, that looks pretty much like that other sculpture we just looked at. This one, right? It's similar. It just looks like a human form that's very three-dimensional, has lots of depth. It's a sculpture in the round. And that's true, but this has been cast into, I believe this one is either bronze or gold, or copper. I guess it's probably, I don't know, it looks pretty gold. But the way that's done is, yes, first it would have been created out of clay, most likely, or some other sculpting material, but probably clay, sculpted by the artist in all that detail you see, and then a mold was made out of it, or over it, to keep all the details and show all the intricate parts and sculpting that was done. So modeling was done initially. Then once the mold is made, the original sculpture goes away, and molten gold, bronze, copper is poured into the mold, and that is the cast. That's what the word cast comes from.